Hey guys, Richard Holdner here, and welcome to the channel. Before we get started, make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell. Just go ahead, get it over with. Today we're taking a look at a Dodge Magnum 360. What happens when I go to the wrecking yard and grab one? Two questions. Will it even run? And how much power does it make? In this video, we're going to cover all the steps necessary to take a Dodge Magnum 360 from the wrecking yard and get it up on the dyno and get it running to find out if it even does run. And along the way, we might also find out what happens if it only runs on 7%. All right, we've got our injectors up here for the Dodge Magnum. Got them up on our ASNU machine. Put them through the paces. We actually already ran one cleaning cycle just to make sure that they were okay. Now we're going to check. We've got to get you guys in a position here where you can see that. So we're going to prime everything. That's a good sign. Seems like everything's firing. So now we'll go for a leak test. I'll just run that just for a little bit here. And nothing dripping out. That's good news. So now we'll see what the inductance is. Well, they're all fairly even, a little less than 10, a couple of them a little over 10. Seems like they're all firing. So then what I do is I just like to go all the way up to static flow, and we're going to flow it for 10 seconds. So put this here, so that we can measure everything. And away they go. All we want is for them to all be even. That's what we're looking at. So let's see here. Hey, for junkyard injectors, that's pretty nice. These things will run perfect with a stock motor, so we'll put them back in. So here's some more prep work on the injector. What I like to do is spray off the O-rings so they go in nice, both the top O-ring and the bottom O-ring. That way they slide in and you don't tear the O-ring while you're trying to put them in, especially on an old set like this. Also give it a little shot in the fuel rail. Just make it. So one of the other things we'll have to do is change out the distributor. We'll get rid of the distributor that's controlled by the factory computer. We'll put an MSD in it so that we can use it with our Holley HP management system. So now we need to take all the spark plugs out so we can rotate the motor around, get it set up so it's at #1 TDC, and then line up the distributor. When you got to lock that distributor. Oh yeah. So the next thing we got to do is take out this fitting right here, and then we're going to replace it with an oil fitting so that we read the oil pressure on the dyno. So now we'll put our oil and filter on. Put a little bit in the filter before we put it on. I'm not going to fill it all the way up because this thing's at an angle. Makes putting it on a little bit harder. A little bit on the gasket. So next we'll put some oil in it. I just got it from the local auto parts store. Full synthetic 530. People ask me all the time, what's your favorite oil? What do you get? Whatever's on sale. Especially for a junkyard motor. You don't want to spend good money on oil if we don't even know if it's going to run yet. So what we'll do is put this oil in, and then we'll crank it over and just make sure we have oil pressure before we even go any farther. Then we can finish up hooking up the fuel injection, get fuel lines to it, and see if she sparks up. Boom. So one of the other things we had to do to prep this thing to get it ready to run up on the dyno is obviously we've got the stock exhaust manifolds on it, but we had to have some sort of exhaust aiming back to the back here. So we welded up a couple of pieces to make sure we had a provision for an oxygen sensor. And we did a similar thing over to the other side. We want to run the stock exhaust manifolds because eventually we're going to be putting headers on and we want to run that test, but obviously we got to get a baseline. So if we go around here, we've got the other stock exhaust manifold. And since we try to make work with what we have, we end up with stuff like this. That's actually a section from a turbo deal that I did, but it has a 3-inch V-band. So we got this connection, and we're just trying to route the exhaust back there in the back, and we're taking the O2 sensor reading from one side. Factory plugs look a little iffy here, so I went ahead and put a new set in. You know, cheap insurance. We don't want to be fighting the tune and have it be a bad plug or something. We reused the factory wires, but we did replace the plugs. Obviously, we had to hook up the Holley HP management system. So we got the wiring harness. It's actually pretty simple. You know, we've got injectors. We're running an MSD distributor. It plugs right in. You know, a couple of plugs here and there, and she's ready to go. The other thing we had to do is hook up a throttle linkage. As you can see, it's drive-by wire. Simple bracket out here. As long as we get full throttle and we have full throttle, whoa, that's really all you need. You might notice some bright red hoses here. This is for our vacuum reading for the dyno, or boost if we happen to run boost at a later date. We've plugged a lot of the holes here. This is a water line. Right now, we're just force feeding this thing water, and it's exiting out the top, going back into the dyno. We also had to make sure that we plugged a number of the vacuum lines. You can see our water pump here, just getting it force fed from the dyno. So, you know, simple plug, we just loop this stuff around. We also have a signal going to the map sensor. Here's our map sensor. Underneath here, you can see the fitting down below. 1-bar map. Got our distributor hooked up. All the wires we reused, those all seem to be in really good shape. So I'll have the insulators there. Looks like everything's pretty well hooked up. Almost ready to start. So one of the last things we need to do is hook up the fuel line. We've got an air motive regulator. We're running this as a deadhead system, so we've got a big air motive pump on here, more than enough. We flowed our 27-pound injectors, and those are in good shape. We're reusing the factory fuel rail. So we just have a line running from the regulator up, basically feeding the factory fuel rail. We can adjust the fuel pressure. Simple adjustment right there, no problem. Right now we have it adjusted at about 50 psi, but it doesn't really matter because we can trim everything that we need to trim. We're getting very close. It's looking good, so fingers crossed. We want to make sure, we already checked to make sure we had oil pressure, so we know we have oil pressure under cranking. With our, we refilled this thing with fresh oil. Let's find out if she starts up and runs. As you can see from the dyno results, not only did we get the Dodge Magnum actually up and running, but it also made fairly decent power. So it seems like it was a fairly good example of the breed. And we ran this thing, as you can see from all the videos and photos, we ran it with the stock 2-barrel throttle body feeding the beer keg intake manifold. We forced water through this, so this thing was run a little colder, obviously, than you would normally run them. It was run with the stock exhaust manifolds, feeding 2.5-inch-ish exhaust, because one side had a slightly bigger section. But 2-inch collector extensions, if you will, no mufflers or catalytic converters or anything, and obviously no accessories either, which is why this thing is making, probably more power than the factory was rated at. We also had an optimized tune, and thanks again to Ish and Eric over there at West Tech for getting this thing up and running and allowing me to do some stuff with it, and all of this stuff worked out very well. But run with the stock exhaust manifolds, and then everything else was bone stock, the stock head, stock camshaft, stock short block and compression, all that stuff. We ran it on 91 octane pump gas, and so equipped, the 360 Dodge Magnum produced a peak of 288 horsepower, all the way out at 4,300 RPM, not a high RPM screamer. Peak torque was 386.6 foot-pounds of torque at 3,200 RPM. So obviously the beer keg manifold and the mild cam timing all contribute to make this thing tuned at a lower engine speed. This thing is, the 360 obviously designed much more for torque than for maximum power production. But before we go, and obviously I wanted to show you what happened is when we were doing the tuning on this, we had a misfire and we had a problem, and it turned out to be the fact that we just had a dead hole. So we were trying to tune around this, but I wanted to show you guys because I thought it was interesting information. This is what happens when you don't have one of the cylinders firing in your V8. The power output was down to 245.7 horsepower. And I don't really have a peak torque number because we didn't start the load quite as low. The other thing to think about is this thing had 25 degrees of timing on the dead hole version because this was early on when we had just started tuning it. But it gives you an idea of how much different the power is here. And by the way, 2 degrees of timing, we went from 25 to 27, which is where this thing seemed to make optimum power. But it was only worth about maybe 10 horsepower, 11 or 12 at the very most in the different spots. So the timing, the extra timing wasn't worth a ton. But you can see when you have a dead hole, it takes away quite a bit of power. And in our case, it turned out to be something simple. It was just an injector clip that was not plugged in all the way. It had vibrated itself loose. Once we got that in there, that hole was firing. Everything was happy. The thing idled well. It idled like a stock motor and made power just like a stock motor. Now check out part 2 when that comes up. We will be doing some mods on our Dodge Magnum 360. Okay guys, what's the takeaway from our little adventure? Going to the wrecking yard, picking out a Dodge Magnum 360, doing all the prep work and getting it actually running and up on the dyno. The first thing you should have realized is that there's a lot of stuff that goes in between getting it from the wrecking yard and hearing it run. There are a lot of steps. There's a ton of prep work that has to go into actually getting it to work. And since not everything goes smoothly, when you try to run things on the dyno, sometimes it takes a lot of time. The next thing you should have realized is that if you have a V8 and you lose one of the cylinders of your V8, it's definitely going to drop power. Now, the good thing about that is it's usually pretty easy to diagnose. Take a look at the normal things, spark plugs and wires, or in our case, turned out to be an injector clip. Plug the injector clip back in, the cylinder's making power, and voila, it turns into a V8 again. The final thing, and most important thing, is that our Dodge 360 is now tuned and ready to go. It's ready to rock, which can only mean one thing. It's time for some power mods. So take a look at part 2 after I post that, and take a look for some power mods. We're going to test long tube headers and nitrous on our Dodge Magnum 360. Remember, this thing came from the wrecking yard, and here's a little spoiler. Both of those made good power. Remember, you're older, make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff. More Magnum testing coming up.